Hi, it's Barry here. In this video, I want to cover why I think anchoring is one of the most important skills you can learn, not just as a hypnotherapist or an NLP practitioner, but as a communicator in general, because anchoring is happening all the time, whether or not you're aware of that consciously or you're doing it deliberately. Anchoring is happening all the time, and you better know what you're doing because it's really, really easy for a hypnotherapist or a therapist to anchor negative states in their clients and then wonder why they can't get them into resource states. And this is so common, you just would not believe. So let's talk about this. Why is anchoring so important? Well, to me, when you look at people's problems, most of their problems are as a result of negative anchors. That there's some context that they go into their life, or there's some situation in their life which triggers them into going into a negative state. One of the big illusions with people's problems is that the assumption is that they happen all the time. You know, a client comes in and says, I have anxiety. The temptation is to think that they have anxiety all day, every day. That's just not the case. There are times during the course of the day where they're not thinking about anxiety at all. What happens is they go into a specific context, and within that context, there's a trigger that triggers them to go into that emotional state. So that's a negative anchor. And understanding this makes change works so much simpler, because if you can identify the context in which the problem occurs, find out what the trigger is, then all you have to do is to find a resource state that's stronger than the problem state, and then link the two things together and compound them, and then reinforce it and future pace it. And pretty much most of the time, that's all you need to do. So let's just have a look at what some of the problems are that are as a result of negative anchors. Well, pretty much any problem that's likely to walk into your office is going to fall into the structure of when X happens, client feels Y. So there's some X that triggers them to feel Y. And this happens so often with virtually every problem you can think of that comes into your therapy office. So for example, a phobia. Person sees spider, feels bad. Person who's overeating, they see a commercial on the TV about food, they go and eat. Person opens fridge, sees trifle, eats it. When ex-client feels Y. Person who's got a drink issue, they walk past the pub, smell the beer, they do that behavior. So many of the behaviors that we work with are just stimulus response conditioned in events. And so this is negative anchoring. So in order to come up with creative solutions, we need to be really, really conversant with anchoring and how to then solve it. So this is really important. So the second thing is that you need to understand that, before I turn that over, that so every problem occurs in a context. So we want to find out what is the context in which this problem occurs. This to me is where the skills of using things like the meta model come in, the series of questions to find out exactly what is going on and why. So we want to find the exact context. When was the last time this happened? Run me through that. What was happening? Run me through that situation. Go there now, be there in your mind. What's happening? What's happening next? What's happening next? And what we'll find is, at a certain point, we will find the trigger. And in NLP terms, this is called the synesthesia, where two senses are linked together. So for example, a visual and a kinesthetic, for example, might be linked together. So a lot of phobias are what are called VK synesthesias, where the person sees spider, instantly feels bad. The senses are linked together like this. So that's what we're looking for. What is the trigger? And then what is the emotion? So this is what we're looking for, and typically you can think of it in these terms, because often that then leads to a behaviour. So for example, overeating, drinking, it's going to lead to that behaviour. So whenever we're working with a client, we want to find out what's the context, what's the trigger, what is the emotion, and what's the behaviour. And then we want to intervene here at that trigger. Clearly, we're not changing the context, because they are going to be going into the real world and they're going into their lives. We're not going to change the context. What we need to do is to find that trigger. What is that X that triggers Y? And then what we need to do is to come up with some stronger emotion that is the opposite of that, i.e. not Y. We want to have them access that not Y and really associate with it, and then bring that to bear on the X, the trigger, so that the trigger now triggers a new emotion. Now when they're in that new emotional state, they can behave in a new behaviour. So this is why anchoring is so important, because virtually every problem that you'll see is a result of a negative anchor. So the solution is finding out the context and the trigger and then changing it so it responds in a different way and condition that in. So what are the sort of things that can be triggers? Well, that's the million-dollar question, because you need to work that out with that individual client. But it's going to be one of the senses. So it's either going to be a visual, either internal or external trigger that leads to the negative K. So what I mean by that is it's either going to be visual external, i.e. something they see. So they see the spider, they see the dog, they see the audience, whatever, they see the look on their boss's face, they see the pub. Or it's going to be internal. Now what could that be? When they recall a memory from their past where they respond in that same way. You know, oh God, this is just like such and such. And they bring this image of some catastrophe that they had in their past or some trauma from their past, and they feel bad. So it's either going to be internal or external. It could be auditory, and that could be either internal or external. It could be that when they're in that context, they say to themselves something. This is really common when you're working with anxious clients. They'll be talking to themselves at 1,000,000 miles an hour, like, oh my God, I'm going to die. And that puts them in the negative K. But it also could be a sound, external from themselves. I've worked with a lot of people because of my connection in the horse world. I've worked with a lot of people who unfortunately have had to have their horse shot. Now, it's a horrible subject to talk about, but when that horrible day comes when you have to have your horse put down, there's typically two ways that they do it. They either inject the horse and it just sort of topples down and dies, or they shoot it. And some of the old time people, they think that the shooting method is the quickest one, the most humane. The downside of that is those people who are there with their beloved horse and they're holding that, wanting to be there when it goes, they shoot the horse. They can never get that sound out of their head. And so when they think about it, they have a real bad negative K. So any sort of negative sound, like any sound like that, can trigger this negative K. So it can be auditory. It could possibly be kinesthetic. So it could be, particularly if you work with people who've got any sort of health anxiety, they might feel a sensation in their stomach and go, oh my God, I've got cancer. So that could be it. So that could be internal. Or it could be a touch. Classic example, person is at a funeral, let's say for example their father's died or whatever, and they're watching the coffin go into the ground, and people keep coming up and going, I'm so sorry, Barry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. That negative feeling could get anchored to it. Then 6 months later, someone walks up to them in the pub and goes, hey Barry, how you doing? And they're in a negative state again. So it could be kinesthetic external. This can often happen with clients who've been abused in the past. If they're touched in a certain way, they don't, obviously it brings back some terrible feelings. It could possibly be olfactory, i.e. sense of smell. I've got an example of that many years ago. When I was moving house, I was going around looking at houses, and I looked at this particular house that was owned by an elderly lady. And the moment I walked in the house, it had that kind of old lady smell, and I was immediately transported to being around my nan's house as a kid. It just smelled the same. So it could be a sense of smell. That's quite common when it comes to things like allergies. And it could be gustatory, which is taste. that leads to the negative state. But these are unlikely. Most of the time, most of the problems are going to be some variation of visual or auditory. And what you want to do is to find out what that trigger is, and then your next job is simply to find out what resource is bigger. Find out what is a resource, how do they want to be instead, how would they like to be instead. Find a resource that's bigger than the problem, and then we're going to anchor the positive one, anchor the negative one, and then we collapse the two in one way, shape or form. And so this is why anchoring is so important. It's at the heart of everything we do. So even if you're a hypnotherapist who's never really thought about anchoring, I want you to think about this. What is the purpose of suggestions in hypnosis? Now, it's not to magically program the subconscious mind. That's not how it works. The purpose of suggestions when you're doing hypnosis is to elicit a state. That's what you're trying to do. You're finding the problem and you're trying to elicit a resource state in the person in hypnosis. So what you're doing there is anchoring. And you can do it by telling a metaphor and telling some stories or giving some really powerful suggestions and things like that. But wouldn't it be better to do it like with the precision of a surgeon and to be able to go in and get the specific state that you need that will nullify the problem? And this is the promise of anchoring. And if you go back and you look at one of the early NLP books, the patterns of Milton H. Erickson, written by Bandler and Grinder, this is what they really identified. This is what Erickson was doing with his telling of stories. He was eliciting the states in the person and then bringing them to bear on the problem. So whether you like it or not, you're doing anchoring. And so it's so important to learn this. But it's so important not just from a therapeutic point of view, but also just the interaction that you have with your client. Because guess what? You can anchor not only in the visual senses, so you can anchor visually, you can anchor with your tone of voice, you can anchor kinesthetically by touching them, you could anchor with a sense of smell, you could anchor with a taste. Well, anchors are happening all the time. And so, I'll give you an example. If you're sitting there with your client and you are taking your notes and you're asking them about their problem, and you lean in and you go, oh yes, 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 and you're sitting there like this, yes, I understand, yes. And the person's in this negative emotional state, and you're using all your empathy and all this sort of stuff. You've got rapport with them, and they're in the negative state as you're sitting forward looking at them earnestly. Guess what's also happening? They're anchoring that negative state to you in that physiology. So it's really important to know this, because that physiology, that tone of voice, that facial expression that you're using at that moment in time is anchoring them into that negative state. So if you then go, okay, tell me how you want to be, how would you like to be in the future? If you don't move your physiology, if you stay in that same seat, in that same position, with the same tone of voice, with the same gestures, they're not going to be able to access any resources because you're holding them in the negative state. So whenever you've talked about the problem, found out what the problem is, you need to shift position completely, move the chair slightly, sit back or sit forward, whatever it is, do the opposite of what you've been doing. Because if you don't, you will anchor them in the negative state. And I've seen this so many times when I've watched other therapists work. They'll sit there and they'll talk to the person about the problem, and they might be leaning in like this, looking at them earnestly and going, all right, okay, there. And that state is getting anchored to them in that position. Then they do a bit of change work, and they have the foresight to move out of that position and do this great bit of change work. And then comes towards the end of the session where they've emerged them from hypnosis, and then they go back and sit in the same pace as they were sitting before with the same expression on, and bang, they fire the same negative anchor off, and now they've just undone everything that they've just done. Yeeks. So this is why it's so important to understand how anchoring works, because you're doing it whether you like it or not. So one of the things I do is try and teach therapists how to make use of anchors and how to use them effectively and with volition. And I've got a new course coming up this weekend on advanced anchoring, where you can anchor covertly, you can anchor with your voice tone, you can anchor with your body, you can do all these sorts of things, and you can elicit these states from your client and help create change automatically, covertly, without making a mess of it, without taking them back to the problem. So if you're really interested, the link is in the bottom. But it's going to be a really powerful course. I'm going to teach many different methods of advanced anchoring skills, including how to work with addictions such as alcoholism and smoking and overeating, how to create negative anchors and use those, because there are times when we don't want to be putting in positive resources. There are times when we actually want to be using negative anchors with volition. And when you have this level of skill, you can create change so much faster than the average hypnotist, particularly if they're using scripts. So I hope you have a look at that, and if not, just have a look at my website. There's loads of different other products on there about anchoring, but it's one of the most important skills you can learn. Check out some of the other videos that I've got on my YouTube channel and have a look at the membership site as well, because there's loads of videos on there on how to be a better therapist and how to learn anchoring, because it is the most important skill you can learn as a therapist, but also as a communicator in general. So I hope to see you then. But if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments below and I'll be glad to answer them for you.